Welcome back. Well, a new bill is in the pipeline. It'll protect employees from workplace harassment and violence in the workplace. As you already know, there are all sorts of laws around this, but the new policy will apply to all sectors of the economy, so the informal and formal sectors. It'll also include issues like work trips, accommodation, changing or washing facilities. Dr. Annelie Gildenhys is commissioned at the Commission for Employment Equity. Dr. Gildenhys, good afternoon to you. What's this new policy aimed at doing?
Thank you for having us. The new policy on violence and harassment aims to extend the concept of violence and harassment in the world of work. So the application and the scope of it is quite broad. And whilst we have an existing 2005 code on sexual harassment, what we see in this code now is an extension to all different forms of harassment and violence. So interesting, Stephen, the term violence and harassment is now used as a single noun. It's proposed that it's a single word, and it then therefore integrates violence and harassment in physical, psychological, emotional violence and harassment, and includes gender-based violence.
Okay, I mean, in a way, this is part of what we're beginning to understand as human beings, that words are violence, often.
Yes, absolutely, and it is very, harassment is a deeply complex issue. The code aims to give direction, interpretation, and very interestingly also looks at the test. When is it harassment in terms of racial discrimination and harassment? When is it sexual? When is sexual advances? So it seems to, it aims to expand. It particularly looks at prevention, the role of employers to prevent and manage and create awareness, but also be very clear on the policies and the procedures. The code also relies on worker unions, employers' organizations and employers, and it also talks about a very broad scope of those who are involved in the world of work.
So, I mean, I made the point that words can often be violence, and I fully accept that, but is there any distinction drawn between them at all?
Yes, it is, and also included in this proposed code is bullying, the whole aspect of cyberbullying, and bullying over the internet or social media. And so we are looking at physical, psychological, and emotional and sexual violence, not only against a person on person, but a group of people, and also against oneself. Interestingly, also in the code, it starts addressing the effects of domestic violence, where traditionally an employer may not have felt that the impact of domestic violence is relevant to the workplace. The code also addresses those forms of violence and harassment, and it is a physical or a threat thereof, an actual or a threat that could constitute violence and harassment.
I would suggest that, I mean, in a way, there's going to be a lot of cases coming through about WhatsApp groups. That's an area where it's quite easy to bully someone. You can shame someone in public, but not in public, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Currently, WhatsApp communications, even emojicons, is a way in which we communicate. And as we all now have become more aware that work is mobile, and where traditionally people thought, well, if it happens at a hotel or outside of the workplace or on a WhatsApp, it cannot be constituted as violence and harassment in the workplace, and therefore the world of work is quite a term to get a hold of. This code, Stephen, I should just add, is an aim by the Commission to align to the International Code of Good Practice that was adopted in June last year, and it is the Commission and the Department of Employment and Labour's recommendation that South Africa ratifies this code, and therefore this gazetted draft code talks about this form of discrimination in the workplace and exactly what needs to happen.
Dr. Gildenhys, you mentioned a test, and I mean, I presume you're talking about what I suppose is really a legal test. It actually can be very difficult to know when you've been harassed, or to know what harassment is, or to know even what bullying is. I mean, I realize that every single incident will have differences, but what sort of is the proposed test in the bill that you're looking at, in the regulations you're looking at?
In the subordinate legislation, yes, we have addressed all forms of violence and harassment, and we have stipulated elements of it. And that's exactly the aim of this code, is to be clear of that a sexual advance can become as sexual harassment, or different forms of it, the elements. And then there's always the debate of the actual test. Is it a subjective test? Is it an objective test? Or is it a reasonable complainant or a reasonable victim test? South Africa, we've leaned towards a more of a subjective test in terms of sexual harassment. So in other words, it is how it is perceived by the receiver thereof, not the intention of the perpetrator, but it is how a reasonable person would have acted. And you would have seen in the case of sexual harassment, the definition has been brought in that a person should reasonably know or ought to have known that it is wrong, and it is as received. And then where we deal with racial harassment, for example, where the elements are listed, and again that it would be a reasonable objective test. And the same with bullying. I think bullying, very often employers are very worried that if bullying is brought in, any person who just doesn't like their manager could bring in a case of bullying, and that is not the case. Bullying is very pervasive very often, and it is those subtle forms of bullying, and therefore we have very clearly given definitions and elements, including, as I said, online and cyberbullying, of what distinguishes bullying from just an ordinary dissatisfaction.
Okay,
and that's one of the code.
So when you talk about a subjective test, in other words, how the victim feels, how they're made to feel by this behavior, would that sort of be halfway there?
Yes, and also the impact thereof, and the nature of the conduct. For example, in sexual harassment, the nature of the conduct must be sexual, and it could be physical, verbal, and non-verbal. And we know that we've got interesting case law in South Africa, particularly where people just proposition another person at the workplace. And you ought to know that the workplace is not a place where you are going to proposition your fellow employee, because they need to be treated with dignity and respect. So it's always the difficult part of what happens with consensual relationships at the workplace. So these are the areas that the codes try to give more clarity on.
This is an impossible question to answer. It's almost an impossible question to ask. So let me just start my strange question like that. Is the definition of behavior that is considered acceptable changing? And I'm not saying that in a critical way, but what I am saying is that the law seems to be catching up with how we view things. Let me give you an example. All sorts of things we now know happened in Hollywood and in a way was seen as normal. I mean, they were terrible, but was seen as normal. The Me Too movement came along and showed us how bad it actually was. In a way, our law is catching up with all of that. Would that be sort of the right way to understand it?
I think it's spot on, and I think social norms have changed. South Africa has had very, very liberal legislation for a long time, but the concept of violence and harassment refers to a continuum of unacceptable behaviors, and what you ought to know is right and what you ought to know is not right. And also, of course, it is not, in the case of sexual harassment, limited to male on female, but it also includes your gender and sexual orientation, and particularly a form of harassment included here would be the LGBTIQA plus community, or persons included in that, and all other forms of harassment and violence.
There is a sort of personal behaviour issue. I mean, the law is very helpful, it's very important, it redresses the power balance, but in the end it's usually the power balance that's the problem, isn't it? The person who does this is someone who has more power than their victim. And I realise victim is itself problematic.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Power in any form of harassment or bullying, violence, has the power imbalance, and it doesn't necessarily refer to a senior to a junior employee, although that happens quite often in that instance. It could also be between two colleagues in creating a hostile work environment, in quid pro quo, or very often sexual favoritism occurs in terms of the hierarchical power balance.
Okay. If I understand this bill correctly, it's also going to apply in the informal sector. Is that new? I mean, I would imagine it might be quite difficult to apply that.
Yes, as I said, what is interesting in us trying to align to the international code is that the scope and the application is far broader, and not that it hasn't currently in the 2005 code of sexual harassment does include anybody who gets into contact with your workplace, but it in this case also extends to the more informal, which would be one of the areas to comment on, and we are awaiting public comment.
I mean, the problem, of course, is that in the informal sector, if someone's not formally employed, it's very easy to informally remove them from their job. If they complain to you or lodge a complaint with any of the authorities, the chances are they're going to lose their income.
Yeah, but interesting, Stephen, what is important to remember here, this is employment legislation, and there are other forms of recourse in terms of other legislation like PAPUDA and those where a person does not fall within the ambit of the world of work. And when harassment in that instance happens where it is not employment related, there is recourse in any event. What the code tries to do here is to draw upon various definitions and various parts of legislation. I believe personally that we have rich legislation in South Africa, but it seems to have been conflicting, and it also seems to have been unclear as which applies when. So the code also cross-references to other legislation, for instance, health and safety legislation. Health and safety doesn't just talk about physical health, it also talks about your emotional and psychological well-being.
Are we seeing the problem of harassment growing? And I realise that's quite tricky because the numbers don't tell us everything. In fact, the numbers often obscure the real picture because a lot of people won't report it.
I think one of my experience over 30 years with any form of harassment, whether it's workplace bullying or sexual of nature or even racial, is very often that people say, well, I don't know how to prove it. It's my word against the other person. The very nature of harassment or bullying or violence and harassment is that it normally happens between two people. And how do you prove it? Also, the process through which one goes very often is having to deal with an investigation and then hearings and then CCMA matters and labour cases is also very grueling to people, and very often that leads to underreporting and the fear of not being believed or not having evidence.
Dr. Annelie Gildenhys, thanks very much indeed, a Commissioner at the Commission for Employment Equity.